news. That's big money. Boy, the cards are a lot easier to do when I do everything from news stories, right? All right, good morning. Welcome to Java with Jerry. It is Wednesday, September 12th, 2018, and we are live, as always, from the Stadium Towers Penthouse Suite in the Platinum Triangle in Anaheim. Orange County is the largest city, and we're glad you're here with us. And those of you who are catching us later on Orange Sliced, we're glad you're here too. And even those of you who are out jogging or doing something productive at the moment and listening to it on Podbean, we're happy that you join us in whichever way you consume Java with me. And I'm always delighted to have you here and to share some stories of the news and some other things that are happening around our world. So we will talk a little bit today about news as always. I will do a few stories as I always do, national, state, and local. And then we are going to jump into a little bit about the elections again. We're doing this little series of coverage about the election. Last time we talked about some national stuff. This time we'll talk about some state stuff. And then later on we'll do some local. So let's start with the news and get going on this day's episode. So yesterday, as everyone knows, it was 9/11, very solemn day for us in towns large and small across our country. There were events huge and small, like the towns themselves, remembering the devastating day when thousands of our fellow innocent citizens fell victim to a murderous attack, the worst we'd ever known on U.S. soil. We have been a nation changed ever since that day in many profound ways. We had to deal for the first time in our lifetimes, for many of us, on a direct attack on our country. Before that, our parents had dealt with an attack on our country in Pearl Harbor, but nothing like what we experienced on that morning of 9/11. This week, though, when this is occurring and we're 17 years now into this experience, we want to think of the thousands that lost their lives on the day, on the first responders who bravely ran into danger when everybody else was running away from it on a really horrible morning in New York City, many of whom gave up their lives helping others, of the tens of thousands of families that were struck with the loss of loved ones, children who lost parents, parents who lost their children, the sacrifice of many who lost spouses and other family members, and the sacrifice of all those who since that day have served or are serving all over the world to keep us safe from terror and to protect our country. We're forever in their debt, forever. May we never forget the sacrifice and forget to honor the sacrifice of those that were there that morning. Pretty solemn event yesterday, and I'm sorry that we have to talk about it, but we do. All right, let's talk about a state story, something a little less solemn, but certainly just as important. So I caught an article. I love Jonathan Lasner's articles in the Register on real estate. He does a good job of going back and finding data and then doing a little analysis for you. And he had a story in the paper recently about housing prices soaring, and he quantified them in a way I thought I would share with you because it's really a brilliant way to look at it. Lots and lots of money, says he, has been made in the local real estate market, and in some ways the dollars are unfathomable. He quotes from stats from the Real Estate Research Council of Southern California, or some of us call it the Research Council on Real Estate, about California's housing stock. Mainly he's talking about detached and attached residences, but not apartments. So attached single families and single family detached homes in Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino County. He picks those four counties, and there's some significance in doing that, which I'll talk about in my own commentary. Anyway, the four county regions housing rose by, are you ready for this? $237 billion in the year ending June, a 9.2% gain. Let me say that number again. These numbers are going to astound you this morning out of Jonathan's article. $237 billion as of June, 9.2% upswing. If you spread that gain across the region's populace, the four counties, it equals $13,075 for each of the 18.1 million residents, even those who don't own a home among those folks. Compare it to the yearly business output of a state, and it is on par with Connecticut's overall economy. Just the growth in real estate up to June last year is on par with Connecticut's economy. Or you can break it down by appreciation of time, and this is where the number gets outstandingly astounding. It's equal to gains, that number, $237 billion, is equal to gains of $7,502 per second for 12 months. Yes, per second. That's 450,152 a minute, $27.1 million an hour, or $648 million a day for a year. 648 million. It's just an astonishing number. If they're still too big to fathom, then think about this. During the time that this was being measured, the entire four-county region's economy, let me see if I get this right, the increases in real estate values, then think about it in terms of all housing in the four-county region. All housing in the four-county region, $2.8 trillion. Just huge numbers. It's equal to the values of, giants like Apple and Amazon and Google. Here's how the housing gains broke down by county so that each of you living in different parts of the region who are watching this have a sense of how your local real estate economy is doing. In LA County, you were up $142 billion in those 12 months. That's a 9.18% gain. Orange County, you were up $52 billion. That's $16,237 a resident, an 8.74 gain. Riverside County up $25 billion. $10,182 per resident. That's a 10.28% gain. Huge jump there. And in San Bernardino, up $18 billion, $81.84 per resident for that period of time, a 9.59% gain. So when they say that real estate is big business, it is, and home ownership is a huge way to build wealth, it certainly is. But when housing prices are rising $7,502 every second in those four-county Southern California region areas. You understand why our millennials are being priced out of the market, why boomers who remain in place are making it tough for others to be able to afford their first homes, why the pressure on building has become so acute, and why the legislature is all of a sudden talking about housing in a significant way and trying to do something about it. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes not so good, but you can't miss a story like that. And so that's our story. I don't know how pricing people out is a good idea, but I read a related article, not written by Jonathan, I don't believe, that said that we're sending an entire generation out of California. They're just leaving as a matter of course. And I don't just mean our millennials, I mean people between 18 and 35, sometimes 40, who are in fact the family age band. Those are the people who are growing families or have families, and they're leaving. And they're leaving because homes are just too unaffordable, schools are not doing very well, traffic is huge, the cost of living is skyrocketing, and they can't afford to raise their families here, and that's not a good thing for us. It's not a good thing for California in gross to be exporting those producers and young families and importing poverty. It's a bad decision for us to do that. All right. That's your state story. Let's talk a local story. This is one that you could have seen coming. I read this in an article too. Kudos to Brooke Staggs, who wrote about it in the September 10th Register, and you can go read the entire article if you want to, because I'm just pulling pieces out of Ms. Staggs' work. What did she write about? She wrote that marijuana stinks, that people in localities all over California are coming to grips with the fact that now that we've legalized the consumption and use recreationally of marijuana, it's sometimes impacting your quality of life. So a little bit out of her story. Marijuana odors have triggered lawsuits against cannabis companies. Not surprising. It's led to an attempt by residents to block commercial operations from California and 8 other states where recreational cannabis is a big and increasingly, can't even speak, growing big business. Odor has sparked some neighborhood friction as well, as people light up their marijuana and it drifts from one apartment or yard to the next. People are having a reaction to it, the smell, as well as a reaction sometimes to the drug itself. Only with odor control are the areas able to consume this usage and not bother others. And there are marijuana entrepreneurs starting to look around their industry for ideas about how they can control odors. Cities can mandate odor control systems for home growers as a condition of marijuana-related businesses, and they're starting to do that in some places. But the licensing agencies are in a learning curve, according to Chuck McGinley, who's a technical director at St. Croix Sensory, a lab in Minnesota that tests for for odors. He says there is a very young and strong industry growing, but they're at the very beginning of it. Residents claim that the stench of weed disrupts their quality of life, lowers their property values, and causes problems for people with respiratory issues such as asthma, which isn't surprising. Since January 2016, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which monitors air for Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino County, those same four counties we're talking about housing in, has received 11 complaints of odors allegedly related to marijuana growers, dispensaries, or processing facilities, according to Sam Atwood, their spokesman. Santa Barbara County and its cities and its boundaries have received more permits to grow marijuana than any other county in California. Now the residents in a town called Carpinteria say they are stuffing pillows under their doors to block the odors coming from the nearby cannabis farms, and it goes on and on. There have been lawsuits in Colorado and in other areas, and the litigation is so fresh that they don't even really have precedent yet on this. Most odor control solutions for the industry involve tweaking products that are already in use for other noxious kinds of operations like landfills and wastewater treatment plants and other businesses that generate offensive smells. The most common fix is to add carbon filters, or scrubbers as they're called, to the ventilation system. As the air passes through, odor molecules bind to the activated charcoal. As long as everything's properly installed and maintained, then the air that comes out of the vents should be virtually odorless. But those carbon filter systems have to be replaced often, and they're pricey, and large operators need a lot of them. And so you can see that it's going to become a cost problem, and then of course just a matter of getting them in and retrofitting. Currently, California law at the state level doesn't do much to address odors, requiring only that the state agencies overseeing cannabis have odor control as a local issue to be governed by local jurisdictions. Most California jurisdictions have banned marijuana businesses altogether, and cities and counties do not permit them, but simply doing that doesn't solve all the problems, because state operations allow some of them. Long Beach, as one locality, requires businesses to submit an odor control plan when they apply for a local permit, and the system must be certified by a licensed engineers. Local authorities are still the go-to on what you're doing about noxious odors, and while it is legal in California for adults 21 and over to consume marijuana and grow up to 6 plants at home, the residents bothered by the smell have to report it to their local code enforcement as a nuisance. If you live, however, in a homeowners association, or you live in an apartment building and have a landlord, you may have better luck reporting your complaints to those entities who can ban smoking and cultivation in their units under their authority and their own agreements. So there's a little story for you on the local level about what we're going to see as a continuing problem, I think, as marijuana becomes more and more widespread and the use becomes more frequent. More and more neighbors are going to have to deal with what comes with that consumption, and it's not unlike what people were experiencing when they had cigarette smoking in public places, and they were complaining about it in apartment buildings, and they regulated that because it was causing health problems for some people and it was noxious to others, and sometimes a little of both, and they're going to have to do the same thing with marijuana, it seems. So here you have a couple of stories that deal with the issue of housing's too expensive to find, and when you find it, you might be right next to somebody who's consuming marijuana, and that might be noxious for you. And the story highlights something about our quality of life issues. Just at a time when Sacramento is deciding the way to solve the housing problem is for us to dense up development, right? Let's dense it up around train stations. Let's dense it up around transit hubs. You dense it up, and then you have your neighbor who happens to need medical marijuana and has to consume it prolifically. Meantime, you're raising your child in a nursery that shares a common wall, and the ventilation system in the building allows the smoke to waft in. Imagine the conflicts we're going to have. So there you go. That's something to think about when you're planning your next move. All right, let's talk about politics for a little bit, shall we? It's an even-numbered year, and we're a political firm, so it's time for us to talk about it. This is a second in a continuing series of shows we'll do. We'll scatter them in between other shows that we've already got scheduled with guests, where we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the elections, partly because we are a public affairs firm and we want to keep you informed, and partly because it's sort of a critical election. So last time that we talked about the elections, we talked about the Senate race in California between De Leon and Feinstein, and also about the national congressional race. Today I want to really focus on California, and I want to talk about ballot measures. We're going to talk about candidates at another point in time, but I think the ballot measures are important. There's a bunch of them on the 2018 ballot. I think it's important for you to understand how you should think about those and know a little bit about them, and so we're going to cover them really quickly this morning. We're not going to get into depth on too many of them, and I know there are a couple that are very interesting to people, but I'm already being shown where I am in time, and there's no way I'm going to go through 11 propositions in depth. But I want you to get a scan sort of what's going on. And I want to talk about the first few in gross after we talk about what they all are, because they have impacts on your wallet. So what are they? Here's a quick scan through. There are, as I said, 11. I'm right? No, 12. Take it back. There are 12 propositions, but I think one of them got scrubbed. Yeah, Prop 9 dropped out. So really 11 on your ballot. So here's what they are. Prop 1 is a bond measure, issues $4 billion in bonds. Listen to these numbers, people. Remember what we talked about when we were talking about housing costs at billions and millions and how quickly stuff racks up. This issues $4 billion in bonds for housing programs and veteran home loans. Prop 2 authorizes the state to use revenue from a millionaire's tax of $2 billion in bonds for homelessness prevention housing. So it issues $2 billion more than the 4 you heard in Prop 1. Prop 3 issues $8.877 billion in bonds for water-related infrastructure. Prop 4, $1.5 billion in bonds for children's hospitals. Prop 5 revises the way homeowners can, at 55 or older, or those who are severely disabled, transfer their tax assessments from one property to another. Prop 6 repeals the fuel tax and vehicle fee increases that the legislature passed and requires a public vote on future increases. Prop 6 we could spend an entire show on in May at some point. We'll not spend that much time on it today, though. Prop 7 authorizes the legislature to provide permanent daylight savings time if the federal government permits, and that's just a fun one. Maybe we'll spend a little time on that in the future. Prop 8, this is a healthcare measure that requires dialysis clinics to issue refunds for revenue above certain amounts. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but that one is itself complex. Prop 10 is a housing item that allows local governments to regulate rent. And we've talked a little bit about rent control in the past, but Prop 10 weakens one of the protections against rent control. Prop 11 is a labor matter that allows ambulance providers to require their workers to remain on call during breaks. And Prop 12 is an animal protection measure that bans the sale of meat from animals that are confined in spaces below specific sizes. And what that means, I'll try to explain in a little more depth later. So let's talk a little bit about each of them in a little more depth. I'll see how much I can cover in the time that Cece allows me. She's watching the clock and she's got, a short leash on me. So let's see if I can get through these. Let's start with one and we'll get as far as we can. If we don't get to them all, don't be offended if I missed your favorite. We'll get back to it in future shows. I want to make sure we cover the first 4, though, because they're bonds, and I don't think you should treat all bonds alike, and I think you should remember what a bond is. And so I want to talk about the 4 of them, and then I'll give you a little commentary on it, and then we'll move to the others as time allows. Prop 1, as I said, authorizes the sale of $4 billion in bonds to finance existing housing programs as well as infrastructure work and grants to match local housing funds on a dollar-for-dollar basis. 1/4 of the $4 billion, or $1 billion, would help veterans purchase farms, homes, and mobile homes, so directed solely at our veterans. This is an attempt for assistance to affordable housing, and so they're going to float it with a bond. Remember, every time you hear the word bond, you should hear credit card in your head. Floating a bond at the state level and the state's budget is no different than you and your family running out and swiping the Visa or MasterCard. So remember that when you're doing that, you're racking up debt, and someday that debt has to be paid, and it always has to be paid with interest, and it ain't cheap. All right. Number 2 is using mental health dollars for housing as well. Number 2 would free up $2 billion in bonds to pay for building housing that includes mental health services for the chronically homeless, or what people are now calling permanent supportive housing. That's the new catchphrase for it. PSH really is an attempt to marry housing the homeless with the mental health care that they need. The original bonds are part of the Mental Health Services Act that was approved by the voters in 2004 to provide mental health services services to people who needed it. And legislators are now appropriating some of this money a couple of years later and trying to say in Prop 2 we'll use it for housing, but it will be for those who need supportive care. So there's a couple billion more. Now we're up to $6 billion, right? Now we go to Prop 3. I'm jumping around a bit in this article. Prop 3 lets voters decide whether to authorize $8.87 billion more in state bonds. Swipe again. The majority of that revenue would go to safe drinking water projects, to watershed and fishery improvements, with money going to habitat protection, dam repair, and other programs. It's the water fix bill that you've heard so much about. And so now we're up to $14.8 billion so far that we've swiped. And then we get to, what's my fourth one? My fourth bond is Prop 4. Did I miss that one? Or do we talk about it later? Let's see. These are moved around in different places in these articles, and so I don't see it in there. But Prop 4, I will talk about out of my own knowledge, because we did a show a little bit about it, or at least a portion of that show was about it when we had Jenna Jensen from Chalk here. That's a $1.5 billion bond for children's hospitals. All right, so if you added them all together, I said we were at 14.8, we get something like 15.3, 15.4. That's a lot of borrowing, and should you look at them all the same? I told you that you're swiping the credit card and someday you're going to have to pay it back in interest. You really need to look at a bond and decide whether the borrowing for that is directed towards something you think is worthy of attention and if it's being used wisely. And I think you should also look to see if there are taxpayer protections in the language of the bonds. In some cases, in local bonding and local measures, you see taxpayer oversight committees being put together. You don't always find those in state bonds, where the taxpayers get a chance to review the manner in which the money is spent. Of those four, certainly the $1.5 billion, the smallest of all of them that's allocated to children's hospitals, is a worthy thing. We don't have a lot of children's hospitals in California. Where we do, they happen to be centers of excellence. Think of Chalk in Orange County, Children's Hospital of Orange County, and also LA's Children's Hospital, both of whom I think are recipients under this bond, do excellent work on children who absolutely need medical care, sometimes only for a broken bone, but more often for very tragic kinds of chronic diseases. Many of them are suffering from cancer, leukemia, and other major life-threatening diseases, and some of them have mental health issues and deserve mental health care. And so when you look at that bond, you know where that money's going, you know the centers that are getting it. That's easy to account for. When you look at something like the water bond, or when you look at these housing bonds, you need to look a little more critically and decide for yourself whether or not what they're doing with those funds is solving a problem in your community. But whenever you see the word bond on a ballot, your antenna should go up, and you should look at what we're borrowing money for, and you should say to yourself, if this were my budget at home, would I borrow money for these kinds of services if I needed them? And so weigh it and evaluate it the same way you would your own budget. All right, let's move on and talk about some more. I'm going to skip Prop 6 only because it's a huge issue that deserves its own time. It's the gas tax. We have to talk, when we talk about the gas tax, about the manner in which we finance infrastructure. We have to talk about what you really pay to drive on the roads. We have to talk about the misnomer of calling our freeways freeways. They're not. And so that requires much more time, and maybe a guest or two to talk about it as well, because it would be an interesting show. Let's talk about others instead. The one that catches my eye, I have to tell you, is a effort by the authors of Prop 7 that would permanently abolish daylight savings time, or permanently establish daylight savings time, or permanently put us on standard time. We don't know what. The measure repeals a 1949 voter-approved proposition that established daylight savings time in California. They would leave it up to the legislature, that's a dangerous thing, to decide how the state's time should be set. The legislature could then establish either year-round daylight savings time with a 2/3 vote and congressional approval. The driving force behind this is Assemblyman Kanzan Chu, who's been fighting to end spring forward and fall back time changes for the past few years with no success, until his bill this time got to Jerry Brown's desk. and Brown signed it. And so now it's up to voters to decide whether or not the legislature gets a chance to end seasonal time changes with the permission of Congress. What they're going to do with the seasonal time changes and what they do with that discretion, nobody will know until they do it, but that'll be fun. They're playing with our time. As if we don't have important things to talk about in this state, we're talking about what we do with the clock. And for those of you who are passionate about what time you get up in the morning and whether or not the sun is up, I know that's important. I don't mean to make too light of it. Prop 5, we talked about housing and the notion of trying to free up some housing. There are some in real estate that say if you gave people with disabilities or 55 and older the ability to take their Prop 13 protections somewhere and transfer that to a future property of equal or lesser value, then equal or greater value, I should say, then that would open up housing stock and allow some movement in the real estate market. I can't dispute that. That's probably true. Whether it opens up enough to take the pressure off of housing, I doubt, but it's an interesting proposition. And then the one that was taken off the ballot, I mentioned there were 12, and then there's now only 11, was the one to split the state in 3. We can talk about that some other time. And finally, the last one, Prop 12, bans the sale of meat derived from animals and their food products that are confined within certain areas. You'll remember that California passed a similar measure in 2008 called Prop 2, which banned the sale of certain animal products if they were confined in spaces that left them unable to lie down, stand up, or fully extend their limbs. 12 takes it a step further and actually defines the square footages that the animals have to be in, and you can have to go and read up on that yourself because we're all out of time. We didn't get a chance to talk a little bit about ambulance operators and the need to keep the people on call even when they're on breaks. We'll do that in the future when we talk about gas tax and others. But you can see 11 propositions, lots to cover. We could barely just skim over the surface today. There's a lot of work to do if you're a voter in California. You can't just go roll into the booth and only vote on the things that are interesting to you. If you're going to do your job and you're actually going to be a participant in our body politic, then you got to do some reading, you got to do some homework, and you got to watch shows like Java with Jerry, where at least we bring you up to speed on what is on the agenda. All right, we have to go to our feature, and then I have to wrap this up, or Ms. Vasquez will shoot me for going overtime. So today our feature is How to Speak Millennial. This is for you boomers, so you can get smartened up and understand what your millennials are saying and how to talk to them. And today the word is really cutting edge. The word is stan, spelled S-T-A-N. The word comes for all of you from a song by Eminem. And if you don't know who Eminem is, shame on you. You need to get more millennialed up. Eminem did a song where he talked about a super obsessed fan, and he used the word stan as a noun, saying, for instance, in everyday use, you would say, you know, I'm a stan for Katy Perry, which is true for those of you that know I like her music. But oddly, stan is not just a noun. It is, according to some studies made by social media mavens, been turned into a verb. In 2008, someone used it as a verb, so now you can use it as a verb. They did it in a tweet, I think, in 2008. So now you can use stan not only as a noun, I'm a stan for Katy Perry, but you could also use it as a verb saying, you know that I am going to stand for Katy, I'm such a stan for her. And there you are, in one sentence, you use it as both a noun and a verb. So now you can speak millennial with the best of them. And I send that out to all my stans on social media who are faithfully watching Java with Jerry every Wednesday. I'm down to how much time? Just enough time to close out the show. Thank you for being here. We hope that you stand for us every Wednesday and that you stand for Katy Perry too. She's very talented. All right, we will see you next Wednesday. We'll talk a little bit more about whatever's going on in public affairs and public life. We will have more features for you. Maybe we'll do a dumb criminal story next week. And don't forget to send yours in. It's the way you get your own Java with Jerry mug. Until next Wednesday, have a great week. Make good decisions. And we'll see you next time this week, same time, for more Java with Jerry. Did I do it on time, Cece? Are we out?